I left because Andy had said he would never do the show longer than 5 years. And I had a 5 year contract, and during the fifth season, I thought, geez, I better start looking around.
For decades, fans of one of television's gentlest sitcoms clung to a much harsher explanation for why its funniest character disappeared. The story that circulated at barbershops and fan magazines and later across the internet was simple and juicy. Don Knotts and Andy Griffith had fallen out, and Barney Fife had walked off the set of Mayberry for good. It made for a tidy piece of gossip. It was also almost completely false. The truth, when it finally surfaced, came not from a tabloid but from the people who had lived closest to it, and it painted a picture that was less about anger and far more about a promise nobody bothered to write down. By the mid-1960s, the Andy Griffith Show had become appointment viewing for millions of American households, and Don Knotts, as the twitchy, trigger-happy Deputy Barney Fife, had turned into the engine that powered its comedy. Audiences didn't just enjoy Barney. They imitated him, quoted him, and counted down the days until the next episode aired, behind the cameras. Though the arrangement that made all of this possible was lopsided in a way most viewers never suspected. When the show premiered in 1960, Andy Griffith's manager, Dick Link, negotiated a deal that gave Griffith majority ownership of the production company behind the series. That single contractual detail meant Griffith would keep collecting money from reruns and licensing for years, even decades, after the cameras stopped rolling. Don Knotts had no such cushion. He was hired under a standard 5-year performer's contract that started him at around $1,250 an episode, a respectable salary, but nowhere near a share of the empire he was helping to build. His manager, Sherwin Bash, would later call the deal a rough one, noting that it left Knotts with comparatively little to show for years of work that helped turn a small-town sitcom into a cultural institution. Knotts never made a public issue of the disparity. Co-workers remembered him as a meticulous, almost obsessive performer, someone who ran his lines over and over in a corner of the soundstage long before anyone called action, refining every twitch, stammer, and nervous glance until it looked completely unrehearsed. That relentless preparation is part why Barney Fife felt so real. It's also part why the financial gap between the two lead actors stings a little more in hindsight, now that we know how hard Knotts worked to make Griffith's show a hit. To understand how Griffith and Knotts ended up in such different financial positions, it helps to go back to how the show was built in the first place, because the two men were not originally supposed to split the comedy so unevenly. The concept for the series came from producer Sheldon Leonard and entertainer Danny Thomas, who wanted a wholesome small-town alternative to the fast-talking city sitcoms already dominating the airwaves. They found their star in Andy Griffith, who had already made a name for himself on Broadway and on film with no time for sergeants. His easy, homespun charm made him a natural fit for a warm-hearted small-town sheriff. A test episode aired in February 1960 as part of The Danny Thomas Show, with Griffith playing a sheriff who pulls Thomas over for a minor traffic stop. The response convinced CBS to order a full series almost immediately, and the show officially premiered that October with The New Housekeeper, introducing Sheriff Andy Taylor, his son Opie, and the fictional town of Mayberry to the country. In the earliest plans, Griffith was meant to carry the comedy himself. Don Knotts, a friend of Griffith's from their Broadway days, who had actually pitched the idea of a jumpy deputy character, was cast in what looked like a minor supporting role. Then came the second episode, Manhunt, and something changed on set. Watching Knotts build Barney's nervous energy take after take, Griffith realized his own material landed better the less he tried to compete for laughs. So he made an unusual choice for a leading man with his name in the title. He stepped back, handed the comic spotlight to Knotts, and rebuilt his own performance around playing the calm, grounded straight man reacting to Barney's chaos. That single decision is widely credited as the reason the show worked as well as it did. Ratings climbed steadily afterward, aided by a distinctive, film-like visual style that set Mayberry apart from the flatter multi-camera sitcoms of the era, and by Earl Hagen's now iconic whistle theme song. A strong supporting cast filled out the world around Griffith and Knotts. Howard McNear's gossipy barber Floyd Lawson, Hal Smith's cheerfully harmless town drunk Otis Campbell, and others who made Mayberry feel lived in rather than invented. By its later seasons, the show was consistently among the highest-rated programs on American television, and it eventually went off the air while still sitting at number 1. a feat almost no other series of that era managed. None of that success required equal pay or equal ownership. It required one creative sacrifice from Griffith, made early and never repeated, because the results spoke for themselves. And growing up in the middle of that unusually functional creative partnership was a 6-year-old actor named Ron Howard, cast as Andy's son Opie, with his own father present on set to guide him. Young Ron spent his downtime quietly absorbing how scenes were blocked and how a well-written show still left room for actors to find natural, unscripted moments. He has said in later interviews that those years on the Mayberry set taught him more about practical filmmaking than almost anything he studied afterward, a foundation that would eventually help carry him to multiple Academy Awards as a director. To really understand why Knotts handled his career the way he did, it helps to look further back, to a frightened kid growing up in Morgantown, West Virginia, in a household that offered almost none of the stability his television character radiated. Born in 1924, Knotts grew up with a father who struggled with untreated mental illness and heavy drinking, and whose volatile, alcohol-fueled outbursts occasionally put the family in real danger. An older brother who also battled alcoholism added to the instability, rather than easing it, and the family weathered the worst years of the Great Depression in a state hit especially hard by it. Knotts' father died when Don was just 13, and according to his daughter's later account, that loss actually lifted a weight off the household rather than deepening its grief. As a boy, Knotts found an escape in performance, teaching himself ventriloquism as a way to imagine a different life. By the time he graduated high school as senior class president, he had already discovered that making people laugh was the one thing that made him feel in control. His mother, 40 when Don was born, kept the family afloat by running a boarding house and stretching every dollar to keep her children fed, while her husband's condition made steady work impossible. After serving in the Army during World War II, where he performed in a traveling variety show for troops overseas, Knotts came home determined to make performing a real career rather than an escape. He hitchhiked to New York with barely $100 to his name, slept wherever he could, and slowly built a resume through radio work in small, poorly paid stage roles. That uncertain stretch eventually led him to Broadway, where a supporting role in No Time for Sergeants placed him in the same cast as a rising actor named Andy Griffith, a friendship that would go on to shape both of their careers. What Knotts carried out of that childhood wasn't only comic timing. It was a low-grade, persistent anxiety that followed him well into adulthood. He struggled with depression and hypochondria for much of his life, and began seeing a psychiatrist in New York in the 1950s, at a time when almost nobody in show business admitted to therapy out loud. His daughter, Karen, has said she would sometimes talk her father through periods of depression rooted in that unstable early life, describing a man who needed real reassurance long after he'd become one of the most recognizable faces on American television. None of that showed up on screen. What audiences saw instead was a performer who turned his own hypervigilance into comedy, who rehearsed obsessively until every gesture looked accidental, and who needed the security of a steady job more than almost anyone else on that set. So when Andy Griffith made an offhand promise on the very first day of filming that the show would only run for 5 years, Don Knotts wasn't just being polite when he nodded along. He was quietly building his entire future around that number, the same way he'd spent his whole life planning around whatever stability he could find. That 5-year timeline was never written into any legal document. It was simply something Griffith said early on, a plan to end the show cleanly while the material was still sharp rather than let it run stale. Knotts believed it completely. As the 5th season approached, he began building the next chapter of his career around that expiration date, eventually signing a 5-picture film deal with Universal Studios, a real opportunity to headline his own movies instead of remaining a supporting player on someone else's series indefinitely. Then CBS made Griffith an offer that changed everything. With the show still sitting near the top of the ratings, the network dangled a significant financial incentive to keep it going past its planned finish line. Griffith agreed to a 6th season. It was a reasonable business decision for him, and it put his closest collaborator in an impossible position. Once Knotts learned the show wasn't ending after all, he tried to find a way out of his Universal commitment so he could stay in Mayberry. He and Griffith began discussing terms that would have given Knotts some form of ownership in the show he had helped make a phenomenon, something closer to what Griffith already held. The talks went nowhere According to author Daniel DeVise, who spent years researching the friendship between the two men and drew on interviews with people who were actually present for those conversations, Griffith and Knott sat down together, away from lawyers and managers, hoping to work things out the way two old friends might. It should have been simple. Instead, the conversation about what fair compensation would even look like kept sliding past both of them. Each man walked away with a different sense of what had been offered and what had been turned down. DeVise describes a breakdown built as much on cross signals as on any real bad faith. Two men talking past each other at the exact moment, neither wanted to be the first to back down. With no agreement reached, Knott remained bound to his Universal contract, and Barney Fife's run as a series regular came to an end near the close of Season 5. For years afterward, fans filled that silence with speculation, and most of the theories involved some kind of personal falling out between the show's two biggest stars. The real explanation was far less dramatic and in some ways sadder. A friendship nearly derailed not by resentment, but by a scheduling accident that neither man had actually chosen, and that both were too proud or simply too busy to fully untangle in public for decades. The show's producers didn't have the luxury of mourning Barney Fife's exit. With ratings still strong, they brought in comedian Jack Burns to play Warren Ferguson, a nervous young deputy meant to fill the void. Many of the scripts had originally been written with Knott in mind, and the mismatch was obvious almost immediately. Ferguson had the mannerisms, but none of the years of earned chemistry that made Barney work. Griffith later admitted the whole experiment made him deeply uncomfortable, and once it was clear the character wasn't connected with audiences, the show quietly paid out Burns' contract and wrote him off. Warren Ferguson appeared in just 11 episodes before disappearing, his leftover material absorbed back into Goober, Floyd, and Aunt Bee. That failed replacement quietly undercuts the old feud narrative from another angle entirely. If real bitterness had existed between Griffith and Knott, there would have been little reason for Knott to keep returning to the town that had just replaced him. He came back anyway, picking up 2 more Emmy Awards for a character he no longer played full-time. Men who genuinely cannot stand each other don't typically go out of their way to keep working together. The years that followed only reinforced how strong the underlying friendship really was. When the Andy Griffith Show ended in 1968, its spin-off Mayberry RFD opened with Knott returning as Barney Fife to stand as best man at Andy Taylor's wedding. Nearly 2 decades later, in 1986, most of the surviving cast reunited for the television movie, returned to Mayberry, with Griffith and Knott slipping back into their old roles, as if no time had passed at all. Howard McNear, who had played Floyd the Barber, had already died, and Frances Bavier, who played Aunt Bee, was too frail to take part. Before her death in 1989, Bavier called Griffith to apologize for tension that had built up between them over the years, and Griffith accepted without hesitation, the same loyalty he consistently showed his former castmates. He and Knott stayed close through Knott's final years, even reuniting professionally on the legal drama Matlock. Knott passed away in February 2006, and Griffith followed in July 2012. By that point, most of the people who truly understood what happened behind the scenes in 1965 were gone. It fell to those closest to Knott to finish the story. His daughter, Karen Knott, spent years after her father's death piecing together a fuller portrait of his life, first through a one-woman stage show and later through a memoir that laid out the childhood struggles, the anxiety, and the career choices that shaped him. Around the same time, Daniel DeVise's book on the Griffith-Knott friendship dug into exactly how the 1965 negotiations had unraveled, drawing on first-hand accounts from people who had been in the room. Both accounts lined up with what Knott himself had already begun saying in his own later interviews. Once he finally chose to address his departure directly, he had made his decision with the information available to him at the time, and if he'd known Griffith intended to keep the show running, he simply would have stayed instead of signing with Universal at all. There was no betrayal buried in that explanation, and no grudge dressed up as closure. It was a man quietly correcting a decades-old assumption, because he'd finally reached a point in his life where getting the record right mattered more than protecting the mystery. Even amid everything he carried privately, his daughter has said he remained a devoted, loving father until the very end. Looking back across the entire run of the show, it's easy to understand why audiences held on to Mayberry so tightly, and why a rumor of real hostility between its two leads was so hard for people to let go of once it took hold. A show built that carefully around gentleness was never going to sit comfortably beside a backstage story about betrayal, which may be exactly why so many viewers found it easier to believe in a feud than in a simple miscommunication over a business contract. The two men who spent 5 seasons building that world were never actually estranged. They were two friends who once misread a business conversation badly enough that it altered the course of both of their careers, and who stayed close anyway, through reunions, through an apology that ultimately came from a third castmate rather than either of them, and through a final goodbye that left nothing unsaid. The real story of why Barney Fife left Mayberry was never about anger. It was about two men who trusted an informal promise a little too much, and who spent the rest of their lives quietly proving that the trust between them had never actually been the problem.